All right, so this is our first InfoTrust Analytics Fireside Chat. First one of these, we were going to cover TMS topics, but in the future, we kind of hope to have these be live sessions that'll then get uploaded to our YouTube, Facebook, and other areas. But with the live, it'll be able to have people interact and kind of ask questions on the go. I am Seth Ruji. I'm an analytics engineer here at InfoTrust. I've been with the company for 4 years, specialized kind of in managing against the Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager APIs to do kind of standardization of implementations across some of our large-scale clients. And I'll hand it over to you, Rachel.
And I am Rachel Joss. I'm also an analytics engineer, and I have experience working on some large-scale automations as well as some data integrations.
Cool. So I guess we can kind of jump right into it. Our topic that we're going to start with is comparing kind of using TMS implementations, particularly Google Tag Manager, but with doing kind of a data layer approach versus doing a click tracking approach or form submission. So I think probably a good place to start with that is to just talk about the history of why data layer is used. Rachel, do you want to start out with that?
Yeah, so tag management systems are pretty new to managing pixels and tags firing on websites. Before tag management systems existed, a lot of times marketers would ask developers to update the website to add their pixels, whether they were firing from a link click or just a visitor looking at a certain page. And all of those marketing tags would be hard-coded into the website itself. And a lot of times the coordination between marketing and development didn't always line up, and it could take a long time for those tags to be implemented. So to improve some of those issues, the tag management systems sort of came to be and allowed marketing to add pixels to websites without engaging with developers, or at least going through the development pipeline and allowing them to add in any marketing tags to any specific events that they wanted to track. And there's a whole host of other benefits and features, but I would say those are the main benefits.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think fleshing out a data layer is kind of the key to a solid implementation for tracking across whichever pixels are trying to be implemented. One quick note, in case those of you who are watching this are not familiar, pixels and tags are more or less the same thing, kind of just different nomenclature, so they'll probably get used interchangeably throughout. So don't let that confuse you.
I would say fun fact about pixels is because the first tags were implemented as image tags, that's why they call them pixels.
They're 1 by 1 pixel. That wouldn't be noticed on the page, even though it was there and capturing data. So, I think the main thing we want to do here is kind of focus on why a data layer approach is more or less better than a kind of click tracking / form submission implementation.
Do you want to start with what a data layer object actually is?
Yeah, that's probably a good place to start. So data layer object is really just a JavaScript variable on the page that captures, it kind of works as an event-driven array that captures when different things are happening. You push an event to that, and then that contains various amounts of data about what was in that event. So maybe you're referencing things that you can't necessarily scrape from the page or that you want to capture from the backend system. So it's kind of a combination of a event queue and of the actual data that then gets populated into it. So it kind of works as a middleware between the development code on the back end that's pulling data from the servers and finding out like different articles or different products that are listed, getting all that metadata essentially as a middle point into when somebody actually clicks on a button or a link and things like that.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point that information added to the data layer can come from a multitude of places. You can have third-party plugins that you have on your site. It could be coming from there. It could be coming from the tag management system itself. Any custom code you have running. There's a lot of different avenues that you can get data into the data layer versus click tracking. You're kind of restricted.
Yep, definitely. I know I've seen there's a number of like WordPress plugins that make it pretty simple to add in Google Analytics events for like WooCommerce or kind of any of those different like e-commerce platforms that it'll pretty much create the data layer for you and then automatically populate those different product information events. So yeah, it doesn't just have to be something that's written by the back-end developers necessarily.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times in the clients that we work with, they have custom data on either like a blog post page or a product page that they want to pull into the data layer. So the nice thing about it is they can specify that information in the data layer object, load the tag management system code, and then use that custom information, whether it's related to like the blog post category or a product category, and use that in any of their tags and triggers.
Yeah, definitely. What do you feel like one of the biggest benefits to using the data layer is as opposed to like doing a click-based approach?
Well, I think one of the big ones is that, as the name states, click tracking is limited to clicks. So whether you're clicking buttons, images, links, things like that, it's all based on the user clicking something. Now, there could be ways around it where you have code that simulates a fake click, but it's just sort of limited in nature. Whereas the data layer push, you can push data at any time from a multitude of different type of events. So you're not limited to just clicking.
That's a good point. I know we've seen Google Tag Managers obviously added more and more kind of built-in features where they give you some of that code for things like video tracking or scroll depth tracking to know how far people are going or how long they've spent on the page. But a lot of that definitely used to be like you would have to write something custom every time. So
yeah, very true.
Good use cases. You know, we see a lot of media companies or companies that have a lot of article driven things where video tracking is super important. While the GTM tracking isn't perfect for that, it definitely helps in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there's a lot of times that we're working on e-commerce transactions, and that's not necessarily something that is click-based. I mean, you create or you finish a transaction and you're either loaded to a thank you page, or maybe just the transaction goes through and the back end pushes like a success notification to the user. So that would be a good spot where data layer push would be more favorable than a click tracking mechanism.
That's kind of one of my favorite things. It just gives you a lot more consistency and knowing that the events that you're tracking are accurate. Because you do get that, like, you can wait until you have that successful response. You don't just have to say, all right, user click the checkout button. Cool, that means everything went through fine and dandy. Whereas if their credit card information is not right or something comes back wrong, like you just submitted a fake transaction essentially.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, I think that is definitely one of the things I really like about it. Is just that like you're able to verify more things and ensure that the validity of them is more accurate. Also, just with like constantly changing websites, click tracking is not as dependable. You have to then kind of verify every single time. Because if you did it just off like click classes or different IDs, those are more subject to change, especially as single page applications are more and more of the focus. A lot of times those IDs and classes are generated dynamically.
Right. And with, different versions of websites, whether it's mobile or desktop, sometimes different objects are used. So that would break tracking as well.
That's a good point. I haven't covered that one in a while. Let's see. So I know, obviously, there's a few different ways that you can capture that information of like the custom dimensions and things that we were kind of talking about earlier. I've seen two primary approaches that work pretty well. One is doing it as the data layer, which kind of has all of that information in it. But I've also seen where some clients will create an additional level of data layer that's just a single object that's always referenced versus having the kind of event-driven data layer. So instead of it being, let's say this is a add to cart button, you only have the information about the add to cart, rather than basically there'll be an additional object that has all of the e-commerce data for that page available. So any products that are there, everything is all kind of consistently referenced, versus in the data layer object, it's more event driven, and then they're able to reference the kind of static like actual data object from the event-driven data layer.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot too. I think it helps to visually see, or at least visually separate your static data from the events coming in, because sometimes when both the reference data, whether like it's the page category or product ID, when that's mixed in with the events, sometimes it's kind of difficult to organize or at least find what you're looking for. And to your point too, a lot of those static, I don't know if you call them a static data layer or like a custom data layer that the website creates. A lot of times they create those before the tag management system is even on the page. So they're able to do that through custom code before the tag management system loads.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that is one of the struggles of TMSs, is if it's not loaded immediately, then you kind of have some issues. I know we've seen a lot of clients where certain parts of this page aren't loaded until a little bit later. Maybe they're lazy loading specific like product carousels or like recommended lists of things. And those often are not loaded at the same point as the rest of the page is loaded, because those are like different modules essentially.
Yeah, and I think from a standards perspective, it's a lot easier to create a standard for that custom data object and make sure that each page is having the same exact data, or different types of pages have different variations, but you can always look to that object and know what you're going to find there, and know whether or not something's implemented correctly. A lot of times we're dealing with that with large clients that have a lot of websites that are built similarly, whether it's different regions, different countries, but they want to have the same data available to all of those sites, because a lot of times they're using a global container and they're expecting the same variables and data to be available to all those sites.
Yeah, that's true. I definitely think it's easier to like keep track of what values are there, but I also find like for debugging and testing purposes, it's really helpful to have it all kind of in that same structure. Gives more like consistency to it. And then I've even seen like some clients, we can set up then like doing front end like Selenium based testing and doing things to kind of ensure that on every release you're checking the status of that object and kind of having consistency about what's in that like static data layer before it then has to get pushed to the actual data layer and go to the TMS.
Yeah, that's good.
I don't think that's an area that we've explored super far, but I know leads to some interesting concepts of like, I know for one client, one thing we started to do but just didn't get very far into was kind of building out a like fully integrated testing system so that anytime they did a release, we would then test their full e-commerce suite like end to end, checking first like at the data layer to see like, are the key events here? Do the product names have the correct, like do they not have any special characters? And then eventually working that through all the way to pulling down the data from Google Analytics real-time API and kind of being able to know like end to end from the point that the hosted website is serving, are all the data layer events working properly?
Yeah, it's kind of the more technical website-based verification, whereas like tag inspector, we're looking at like the firing of the actual tags. That's sort of like once we know something's broken, tag inspector catches it, and then we have to go back and fix it. But what you're talking about is before that, when a site gets changed, it's either monitored to see that certain elements don't exist or events don't fire correctly, which in turn would show up on tag inspector reports. But yours is sort of the step before that to track it before it breaks.
Yeah, kind of the benefit of doing that approach, I think, is that would let we could then have the developers of the actual website run that test suite essentially before they do their push. And that way it would kind of capture that whole setup before it even ever goes live.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know we mentioned it a little bit. I forget at what point we were talking about it, but the use case of having multiple containers on a site. Do you want to go into that?
Go into that. Where do you want to
start? Probably the reason why we would even want to do it, or what would cause us to have to do it.
I think the areas that I've seen multiple containers kind of make the most sense is to have sort of a tiered architecture. This is primarily going to be for larger companies that have kind of multiple levels of sites. So there's maybe a brand level and then a country level and then like city or regional or small different sites within that. So I think that's kind of where there's the most benefit of doing something like that. And as of last year, there's kind of two primary ways that I think that can be implemented pretty well, which is either having like entirely separate containers and let's say having one, we'll say like the national level. So there's one for United States. Then within that, let's say you have two different brands. So brand A would have one container, brand B has another container, and there's the one at the national level. The national one has some specific standards implemented that then each of the like brand specific ones can have their own standards. The other option is then setting up Google Tag Manager zones, which lets you do some of that, but instead of it necessarily being 3 completely unique containers, it lets you specify the permissions. So all of the essential containers are in that national level one, but then it grants access to this set of things for brand A and this set of things for brand B. So I think that's kind of the primary reason I've seen to use multiple containers. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, for your first option, basically where the parent container loads the child container, I think one thing I've seen is that you have like your standards managed at the parent level, and then a lot of times you're granting access for like agencies to manage the child or local container. The one thing is that a lot of times when you're loading the child from the parent, the point at which you load the child container matters, because there's triggers inside the child container that are maybe for DOM ready or window loaded. And if you're loading that child container at page view or, you know, a later trigger, then those, you just have to be mindful of the triggering, because it's not necessarily accurate when you're doing a sort of a cascading load of containers.
That's true. The timing can be really tricky. I've actually seen one client that is done where they inject the containers at the like load balancer level. So instead of waiting until it gets to the site and then starting to load the containers, as soon as it hits their load balancer, it then kind of determines which site it should go to and then loads the appropriate container there, which is kind of an interesting approach to the same problem.
Yeah, it definitely a little bit more technical, but it gets around the issue that I just talked about.
Mm-hmm. What have you found some of the challenges to be about dealing with multiple containers? I know it can get pretty messy to make sure that things aren't, I guess, being duplicated or referencing things from one container to another and going about that kind of process.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, so when you have multiple containers on a site or page, they're using the same data layer unless you specifically make setting changes to have different data layer objects. But they're using the same data layer, so events that are passed in from one container are available to the other. And if you're passing in certain key value pairs, such as like e-commerce data, you'll have access to that on the other side, whether you want it or not. So you kind of just have to be a little bit more careful about, you know, what data you're pulling in, so that you don't either send the wrong data or send extra unnecessary data to places that you don't want it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it can be tricky to make sure you're not sending, I guess, depending on the setup, you may want everything at the parent level, but not always, because then that could just clutter up or send too many hits and be useless data. I think that does lead to an interesting point, though, of having like multiple levels of like analytic setups where you're then able to kind of get standards across like the different brands or things like that to get some high level, like how is North America doing, and kind of lets you see everything similarly, and especially compare the differences of like brand A to brand B, as far as like you can check bounce rates or conversion rates, and then lets you then kind of go into some more advanced figuring out what improvements you could make to one brand as opposed to the other. It might even help to kind of find different, I guess, benefits to doing specific things as opposed to on others.
Yeah, we've done that on a couple of clients where, going back to that custom data object, that they set up on the site. One client specified they had 3 levels. They had a global, a brand, and like site level. And so, like you said, across different countries, they would have their brand level. And then any of the tags and triggering, they would have slightly different tags and triggering for each level, but they actually did it in a single container using some variables to be able to send different hits to whether it was their global GA property or their brand or their local. So it's definitely a good use case to keep your Google Analytics standards across all your brands, all your regions, to be able to, like you said, roll up data at different levels and see the comparisons. I'm trying to think. I know there are some limitations to zones. It's not as widely used of a feature, I don't think, as.
I think it wasn't added. I think it was added last summer, I want to say. I think the interesting thing about zones is that it lets you manage access to which types of things, which types of like tags to grant access to. So if you wanted to say, like, this agency has access to this zone, but only specifically for floodlight tags or Google Ads tags, you can do that, rather than having to just grant edit access to the entire container. So I know that's one of the big benefits out of zones. It's kind of interesting. And you can kind of also specify a zone to fire on either specific like subdomains or paths, and you have access essentially to the data layer from the parent level to decide when you want that child zone to load. So I think like an example of something you might be able to use that for that would be kind of interesting is on a site that you have, like, maybe it's an e-commerce site or kind of just has a full list of like informational things, but then also has blogs and articles, being able to grant access to just the blogs part of container management. So that way, whoever's in charge of writing the blogs and things could do their own kind of unique tracking there, without interacting with the rest of the site potentially. So
yeah. Now I know as far as like GTM goes, a lot of the templated tags are they're either the big name marketing platforms or Google stack. So a lot of times, I mean, there's still a lot of marketing tags that aren't covered there. So you go into the custom HTML tag space. Now, last I knew about zones, you could either allow custom HTML or not. So I think that's just something to keep in mind as far as, there's no more granular restrictions around that. If that's what you're looking for, to only allow someone to create a certain type of custom HTML tag, as far as I know, that's not a feature that's available right now.
Fortunately, with custom HTML being so flexible, it also has the most risk to granting access to in that same regard. I do think that's kind of where the template library kind of steps in now, though. So instead of it just being Google defined, like Google defined tag templates, there's also the community defined ones. And I think that's a big step towards being able to help address that problem. While you still can't necessarily guarantee the consistency or accuracy of that, because it's just created by whoever, I guess whichever company writes it. But a lot of times I do think we see that the company who the tag is for is actually the one who creates the tag template. And I think that then gives a pretty good, they have a lot at stake to make sure that their tag is working properly. So I think it's kind of a good step forward. I know for Tag Inspector, we have worked on creating a tag template. That way, anytime somebody wants to implement Tag Inspector, all they have to do is specify the variable within the template tag that way.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity for all those marketing platforms, not only to ensure people are implementing their stuff correctly, but also for visibility purposes. It's a lot easier for people to see and know about a platform and implement it to the way that they should, if there's a template already available.
I think we've kind of gone off topic now from zones and multiple containers, so maybe now is probably a good wrap-up point for this one.
All right.
Do you have anything else you wanted to chat about, or?
I think one just general thing, when you're working with TMS systems, I mean, we specifically were talking a lot about Google Tag Manager, and each tag management system has a different, how do I want to say, like focus or the way they're based. So GTM specifically is tag based. And so when you're working with it, you're focused on creating tags, and then subsequently you're looking at the triggers and variables to basically fire those tags and have the right information in there. And definitely the data layer plays into that, because that's where you're going to get your data from and where the events are going to trigger. But when you're actually in the interface itself, tags are sort of the main focus. Other tag management systems can be a little bit different. Some of them are more rule-based, where you're actually looking at the triggering first, and then what happens from that triggering is sort of your next step. So just something to consider when you're looking at tag management systems and trying to understand all the different features and functions.
That's a good point. Cool.
Right.
Well, I think we're good. Thank you, Rachel. It was fun chatting about TMSs and doing some deep dives on different parts. So looking forward to the next one of these and seeing kind of where these take off and go. So
yeah, for sure. Let's dive into some more topics.
Yeah. Let us know in the comments, wherever that ends up being, what you want to hear us talk about. We're going to plan to do one of these basically each month for a little while. So we'll have different engineers on here. Depending on the topics, we might try and bring in somebody from our data science team or an analyst that can dive a little more specifically into those topics. But yeah, I think really the focus is just to kind of talk about different things within the analytics space. I know some of the areas that we kind of focus on are like monitoring of tags, and then also making sure the implementations are standardized, automating changes across like implementing different standards, and then working also on integrating everything together into like a data lake and kind of building those integrated systems so you can then do CLV modeling or predictive analysis and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that is it. Have a great day.
All right. Bye.
Bye.